Today, we are focusing on the digital architecture. We're talking about architecture, so you can imagine like bridges and tunnels, all we imagine when we speak about architecture. That's what we have in mind. And actually, when we speak about digital architecture, or we used to speak, we spoke mainly about infrastructure. And for many years, we spoke about the infrastructure of the network, which is the pipes, the networking, the storage, all these that enable actually the data flow. And we spoke about data flows. But one element we seem to forget in the conversation. While there are networks and bridges and digital connections between different actually industries and different countries, the core element, the core building block is still data. It's a digital economy of data. And then, once we were focused in innovation and in public discourse about how we regulate and manage the infrastructure, this architecture, we were talking about issues of network access, about issues of control over the pipes. We were regulating the telecom operators. We were regulating those who are actually controlling the architecture. But we kind of forgot in all this conversation, what about these basic building blocks, the data? The data that has actually enables all this digital innovation. And while we were inspired, and we are still inspired, about digital transformation, the fact that actually data pieces actually transform our businesses. More and more businesses, from finance to insurance to health, are becoming digital by nature and actually being transformed by digital data. We kind of like, we were so inspired and so amazed that we forgot to question, what is actually this data, these building blocks that we rely upon? We haven't asked enough questions about, can we trust the data? Who is the source of this data? Is it accurate? Is it authentic? Can we actually be sure the data was not manipulated, or we are being misinformed about these data pieces? We all know now that we started talking about fake news and kind of like broken algorithms and broken models, but it all started with the problem that we never questioned the data. Never questioned, and now questions of accountability, trust, integrity, origin, accuracy, confidentiality, control come in mind. And when these questions come in mind, the first to address normally it's regulators that are trying to regulate the digital architecture and trying to regulate about accuracy of data and trust and who is responsible. But it's not a legal question. It's a basic design question, because at the core, we never actually have trust mechanisms for our data. We never were able actually to question in the internet architecture whether data is reliable, whether someone manipulated, how vulnerable we are just by the fact that one can actually tap into this data and change it. And now we started asking the questions, and we also understand that data is coming with a context, a social context, cultural context. If you speak to people in the EU, they think differently about issues of control, consent, privacy, rights in data, who should have access to the data. All these questions that we ask in any other domain of our life, about access, control, power, individual freedoms, rights, we haven't asked before. And now when we start asking them, we realize that while we have a digital architecture, there are gaps in the way that we think about data and rights and freedoms in this data. And we understand actually that the digital architecture we build is broken. One has to admit the digital architecture of the internet is broken. You cannot trust data, you cannot know its origin, it's very vulnerable, easily manipulated, easily misinformed. So all these issues that we have, the Russians are controlling the election, a problem of how you actually assign source and integrity of data, cyber attacks, vulnerability of the ecosystem, swift transfer between banks. What is it? Because we cannot trust the data. We understand that the digital architecture came with no concept of trust, and not with the social and cultural context of how we run data. So that's why we see that we're actually looking for a new architecture. If you think about blockchain, and you hear all the time about blockchain, what is actually blockchain? Blockchain is a new architecture of trust, where you can trust the data points, you can assign it to a source, you can authenticate it, you can audit it, and more so you can align governance, controls, powers on top of it. So I'll just end up with you with one thought. Many misconceived blockchain as an architecture of anarchists. They think of Bitcoin. They think of this kind of like unregulated platforms. But actually, it's the reverse. Probably that will be the architecture of the future, the digital architecture. And why so? Because not only it's an architecture of digital trust, you can overlay relations, what we call smart contracts. All these issues, who get access, who get control, who can actually determine what is being done. And that is the cultural and social context overlay on our digital architecture. So when we actually speak about digital architecture, we need to understand it's not only pipes and only data, it's about the social and cultural arrangement surrounding it. And that's what our conference will deal with today. We will try together to understand what are the building blocks of our, you can put it back, what are the building blocks of our digital economy? What are these digital bridges? And I think the big band will explain it much better than I do.
I don't know about this, Howard.
What? You're having trouble with the long-distance lovemaking? This is your answer. There are two interfaces that simulate a human mouth. You have one, Priya has one in India. When you move your lips and tongue on yours, it transmits exactly what you're doing to hers. See? Internet kissing. Good try. I don't think so. I'll try it. Wait, like this? Almost. Really get your tongue in there to activate the motion sensor. Wait, like this? Close. Really French it.
Innovation does it. Digital does it. You can change your world. So let's hear from three disruptors. We'll have in this conference disruptors that will talk about how they disrupt their industry through digital technologies.